Welcome to our class on Iroquois gardeners. Now, the first question maybe we could ask ourselves are, who exactly are the Iroquois? And sometimes they're referred to as the tribe of the Iroquois, but that's not quite accurate. Because the Iroquois actually were a series of different tribes, 5 tribes to be exact, and later 6. And they formed themselves into a confederacy that was called the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, the keepers of the eastern gate are the Seneca over here that comprise the western portion, far western portion of western New York. And we're familiar with them here in Rochester. They were the largest and most powerful of all of the Iroquois tribes, Iroquois Confederacy. The Mohawks were the keepers of the western gate. The Onondaga, who were located right in the center by Syracuse here, were the keepers of the Great Fire. And this was the meeting place that all of the different tribes here, with 5 tribes, would come together and meet when they wanted to discuss matters of importance in the Confederacy. The Oneida were located between Syracuse and Albany here. And then the Cayuga were located over here, kind of where people are familiar with Montezuma Swamp. And that's why the Cayuga were also referred to as the Swamp People. Now, there were some other tribes here that were not in the Confederacy, the Huron up in Canada, and the Algonquins down here and around the Catskills. And the Iroquois were known to have fights. Oh, by the way, the Tuscarora joined the Confederacy in 1722. They were kicked away from their homes in South Carolina, and the Iroquois welcomed them in, and they settled up around Niagara Falls. But as I was saying, the Iroquois tribes would fight with the Huron and the Algonquins. They would have battles with them. And it was actually the Algonquins, their enemy, that wound up giving them the name that they have, Iroquois, because in the Algonquin language, Iroquois means snake. And they gave them that name because they felt the Iroquois were so sneaky in being able to ambush them in battle. Now, Iroquois weren't crazy about calling themselves snakes, so they had another name they referred to themselves as, and that was the Haudenosaunee. And in their language, the Haudenosaunee meant the people of the Longhouse, because they lived, as most people know, in these particular structures that were called longhouses. So when we talk about these tribes, what's interesting when we look at agriculture is that they were some of the earliest participants in agriculture in the entire world. If we look at the origins of agriculture in the world, the very first record we have of agriculture was in Iraq. And they were growing grains there, early Emer wheat, very early versions of wheat, way back in 10,000 BC. And over the next few thousand years, some of these other areas followed, like the Yangtze and the Yellow River Basin in New Guinea and South America, Mesoamerica. But one of those early ones right in here was over here in the Ohio Valley. And over in the Ohio Valley, as early as 4,000 BC, they were doing farming. So our Iroquois tribes were in the Ohio Valley. All of these people were there, and then they later moved up to Western New York. So these Iroquois tribes were doing farming as early as 2,000 to 4,000 BC. Now, what were they farming? Well, you ever hear this expression that I'm not much of a gardener or farmer, all I can grow is weeds? Well, you know something? That's what the Iroquois were originally farming, was weeds. Are you familiar with ragweed? They grew that as a crop. It was a close relative of that, and it was something called sumpweed. And it gives off zillions of these little seeds that they would pound and grain and make into a flour and eat. And it must have been miserable farming that, because sumpweed has the same characteristics of ragweed, that if you're allergic to it, you'd be coughing and squeezing. I can't imagine farming an entire field of this sumpweed. Also, have you ever seen this in your garden called goosefoot? It's a common weed, and a lot of times you'll see it has that little kind of a seedy top. So they would eat the greens here as well as that little seedy top on the goosefoot. How about this one? Do you ever see this kind of coming up from your sidewalk? It's called knotweed. And they grew a version of this as a crop, but it was more of an erect version. It grew a little higher. It wasn't as flat. It was called erect knotweed. And I'm sure you've seen on the edges of your property or in the fields, these kind of grassy things growing, and they look like they have like a little stalk on them, almost like wheat. They're known as little barley or maygrass. And they farmed this as an early type of a grain, where they would eat not only the greens, but they would eat those seedy things and use it as a early form of wheat. Well, as I mentioned, these tribes that we know as the Iroquois Confederacy moved away from the Ohio Valley into our area about 600 AD. When they moved here originally, they actually lived in these kind of hilltop type forts. They would find very high ground in a hilltop, and they would put their longhouses there and build a great wall around that. Because at that time, there was a lot of fighting among all of the different tribes that were in the Confederacy. The Confederacy wasn't formed yet. So as a result, they had to locate very close to a water source. And also their farm fields were quite small. They couldn't do much agriculture because they couldn't get very far away from the protection of their fort in case of attack. So they purposely had to grow a fairly limited number of agricultural plants and keep them relatively close to the walls of their fort. Well, what changed all this and caused their agriculture to boom was the formation of the Iroquois Confederacy. And that was done by two people, actually a Huron by the name of Diganawada and Hiawatha. Remember Hiawatha from the Longfellow poem? He was a real guy. He was an Onondaga Indian who left because they had such a bad chief there, and he got adopted by the Mohawk. Daganawada actually had a bit of a speech defect, and so he couldn't be a good orator, so he had Hiawatha there to do the speaking. Actually, much in the way when you look at the early suffragettes, Susan B. Anthony was the speaker, a key person, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, weren't great speakers, so she took that role. Well, Hiawatha took the role of the speaker. And they were the ones that went around to all of the different tribes to convince them to make peace and join the Confederacy. But they had a major problem. And that was the fellow right in the center. He was a very, very nasty tribal chief that led up the Onondaga at that time. His name was Tuatahataho. And he was rumored to be a sorcerer that could cast spells. He was rumored to have killed his whole family in a rage, and he would have nothing to do with this peace talk. So Hiawatha and Diganawada confronted him. And you would think that the story and legend would be is that they got into a great battle and defeated this evil chief, Todaho. But that was not the story at all. The story was that they reasoned with him. And they spoke with him and they cajoled him and they encouraged him to join with their logical arguments. And he joined and he was all in, and they actually made him the keeper of the great flame and decided that to make that the central meeting places for all the tribes. And they would meet under this large tree. They called it the Great Tree of Peace. And they would have the central fire there. And it was rumored that a giant eagle nested in the Great Tree of Peace. And he would take a lookout and he could see far to see if anybody was coming to council there at the Great Fire. And actually to this day, the honorary title for the keeper of the Great Fire among the Iroquois Confederacy when they come to meet is Tadudaho. They take that name today. Well, what happened when they formed this great peace? It was all documented in a set of laws. And the set of laws formed the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, this was quite formal. They had something called the Great Law, which was their version of a constitution. They didn't have a written language at this time, so it was all memorized and orally done. Twice a year, representatives would go to every longhouse in the Confederacy, and they would recite the Great Law. In the midwinter ceremony, they would recite the Great Law from beginning to end, and then they had like a refresher course. They would go out in the summer, and they would recite the Great Law. Now, what was in this Constitution, the Great Law? Well, it's the oldest Constitution known in the world. And the Iroquois Constitution gave its members equal voice in the nation's affairs. It established a system of checks and balances for power. It guaranteed political and religious freedoms depending upon your beliefs. Unlike our Constitution, it gave extensive political power on the onset to women. And it was infused with the basic principles of democracy and what we would call federalism today. Now, our founding fathers, especially Jefferson and Franklin, were fascinated with this idea of this Constitution. It was the oldest Constitution in the world. And they had meetings with the various Iroquois chiefs to teach them this great law. And they had these translators that they would recite it for them so they could try to understand it. Now, how much did they pay attention to this? And how much did they use these ideas when they were writing up our Constitution and our Bill of Rights? Well, quite a bit. For example, when the Iroquois went to the various longhouses twice a year to recite the Great Law, they had an introductory section they would give. And as the introduction, one of the Iroquois people reciting the Constitution would stand up and start and say the following: "We, the people, to form a union, establish peace, equity, and order." Does that sound a little bit familiar? Do you think Jefferson and Franklin really paid attention and copied a lot of that stuff? Yeah, probably so. Unfortunately, they didn't get recognition until fairly recently. It was only in October of 1988 that Congress passed a resolution that formally recognized the Iroquois Constitution's influence on our American Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Now, what's interesting about their Constitution, and this enabled them, by the way, to build much, much, much larger farms than they had before. So you say, well, how big do these farms get now that they were living in peace and they can go to these flatlands and get away from their high hilltop forts? It's kind of tough to describe sizes of farms. I mean, if you're an experienced farmer and you say, yeah, I got 30 acres planted over here, you kind of know what 30 acres is. But for city dwellers and urbanites like myself, it's like, what does that mean? Well, an acre is about a little bit smaller than a football field, okay? So here is a picture, and it's outlined, you see in red. That is 100 acres outlined in red here. And you can see over here is a home and some barns. So you can get a nice scale of what 100 acres is like, that size. So in terms of the size of these farms at the Iroquois were setting up, a small one was about 60 acres, about half this size. This would be a medium-sized farm. And their larger farms, believe it or not, would be 10 times that size, 1,000 acres that they would have planted. So we're talking about some fairly massive farms that they set up. Now, what's fascinating about the Iroquois agriculture and what do they use to guide it, their approach to agriculture and farming was all guided by their spirituality. If you look, for example, at their constitution, which they established in 1100, and then the Iroquois Confederacy lasted till the early 1800s. I mean, this was talking 700 years that this constitution was effective in keeping peace among all the tribes. Our American Constitution held up for only about 60 years, right? 60 years after it was formed, it was broken by the Civil War. How did their Constitution last so long and ours broke down so quickly? It's because the Iroquois realized that words are just words. They have to be accompanied by the right attitude and the right type of behavior. And they call that the good mind. When they would recite the Constitution at these gatherings twice a year, after they recited the Constitution, they would tell stories. And these various stories were to emphasize what it means to have the good mind. Okay? So here's kind of a description that was written out by some Oneidans on what the good mind was. And they wrote that peace, oh, wait, it comes up. Peace is not simply the absence of war. In the Iroquois mind, peace is a state of mind. Each individual has spiritual power. As you go through life and experience different things, you learn more, you comprehend more, and tap into other ideas, your own spirit grows as well. The power of the great law rests in how well the individual person develops their sense of self to the benefit and well-being of others in the clan, in the village, in the nation, the entire confederacy of 6 nations. So the idea was you wanted spiritual power. And you could increase your spiritual power by getting new ideas and using those new ideas to try to live in better harmony with everything around you, all the people and tribes, and not only with the people around you, but with nature itself. And that has to do with how their spirituality extends to their religion. The early settlers that came into the region thought that the Iroquois tribes, Iroquois Confederacy tribes, had no religion. They couldn't make any sense of it. And they did have Haudenosaunee had a very sophisticated religion. It was just that the settlers couldn't understand it because it was so different from their own. The Haudenosaunee were monotheistic. They have a great spirit that creates the universe and creates all things. So he creates the world. And then to flesh out the world, what he does is he creates all of these life forms. And he takes the life forms and he puts them all up into the stars. And then he has the sky woman come down into this world he creates. And it's all water, so she rests on the back and sits on the back of a giant turtle that comes up to the surface. And she creates all the landforms. But then what she does is she reaches up into the stars and grabs each life form and makes an assignments to them. And says, this life form will be a tree. And this life form will be a babbling brook. And this one will be deer. And this one will be ants and caterpillars. And this one will be rabbits. And then these will be man. So she assigns all the different stars to be the life forms. And then when these life forms die, a tree dies, or a rabbit dies, or a person dies, their form doesn't go away. It goes back up into the stars, waiting for a new assignment. So when the Haudenosaunee look up into a nighttime sky, rather than just seeing lights or stars, what they see are souls. Those are all the souls of a life forms up in the sky, waiting to be reassigned to come back to Earth. And they knew they existed one day as one of those lights. And when they die, they'll go back as one of those lights, perhaps to come back as something different, as a tree or a rabbit or a bear or a deer or something like that. So they saw their whole existence as something where they are there to live in harmony with their companions, these life forms, because you're changing from one form to another as you live and die. The babbling brook that exists may have been your grandmother in some past life, right? So when the Haudenosaunee would pray, they would not ever pray to the Great Spirit to defeat an enemy in battle, because the Great Spirit looks after all life forms equally. So he's not going to favor one over another. So you would pray to your fellow companions for help and for assistance. So for example, if they were going on a hunt and they were going to be hunting bear, They would be tracking to the bear, and they would be calling out prayers to the bear as they were hunting it. Come to us. So once they cornered the bear, maybe they cornered the bear in a cave or something, and they were kind of coming in for the kill, they would say a special prayer, and they would call out to the bear, and they would say to the bear, please, our women and children are hungry. We need your meat to survive. Could you please sacrifice yourself to help us? We desperately need your help. And then they would kill the bear. And they would make sure, since the bear sacrificed itself, that they would use all parts of the bear. They would never waste anything. And they would do a special ceremony where they would take the bear's skull and they would go out into the countryside and find a really, really nice spot. Perhaps there in a meadow, and it would look under a shady tree, and they would set up the skull of the bear on the pole. And it would be in a spot where a lot of animals would walk back and forth in a trail. And they would take a plug of tobacco and they would stick it in the mouth of the skull. So the bear could chew on this tobacco, and the spirit of the bear can tell all the other animals and life forms that were passing by how well he was treated by the Haudenosaunee. And if the Haudenosaunee plead out that they should sacrifice themselves to feed them, they should consider doing so because they'll be treated so well. The Iroquois Chiefs, you imagine some type of a chief of a tribe, you know, ordering people around and dictating this, and that was never ever true. They didn't order anybody around. Everything within the tribe actually was done by consensus. It wasn't even a majority vote. It was consensus. Everyone had to agree to things. So the role of a chief was actually the person who was the consensus builder. And he wasn't picked to be a bossy person. He was picked to be someone that was a very, very good people person, a good negotiator that can go in and talk to all the different people and say, hey, could you give up this to get this and this and this, and get everybody on the same page to get consensus so they could go ahead and do things and make decisions. The Haudenosaunee didn't believe in striking their children. They didn't hit their children, they never disciplined, because the key things they wanted to teach their children were three virtues: patience, tolerance, and modesty. And it's tough to teach patience and tolerance if you're hitting your children. You're giving a bad example. So the worst that they would do to discipline their children would be to splash some water in their face to get their attention. But for the most part, they kind of set them off to play in the woods and kind of let them run around like wild Indians. And that was to build their spirit, this spiritual self, because they wanted them to be able to generate ideas with a good mind, and to generate ideas with a good mind to be able to help and live in harmony and help your companions. You had to develop extreme curiosity and observation. Those are the key tools to develop the ideas and have that good mind to help your fellow man, and nature for that matter as well. So, sounds nice, but exactly how did this spirituality impact their agriculture? Well, I was described before how when the Haudenosaunee were into the Ohio Valley and they moved up here, they were basically farming a bunch of weeds. Well, there were advances that were made in agriculture down in South America that moved up, and that was the development of maize, corn, along with beans and squash, and that moved through the Ohio Valley and eventually up to the Haudenosaunee in Western New York. And so when the Haudenosaunee had these new crops come in, they did not grow it like the other tribes and other people were doing it. The other people over in Mesoamerica and wherever else were putting up what we think of as a traditional cornfield. But the Haudenosaunee said, no, we have some other different ideas on how we want to do things based upon the way we're observing nature. Because when they were out looking at nature, they noticed that plants really kind of grow in clumps, and they like higher ground. You know, a lot of plants would grow up high, and then things would kind of thin out when you got into the kind of lower ground, and things would kind of grow together. So when they decided to put in their cornfields, they didn't plant them like You would think a cornfield would be planted like everybody else was doing it. Instead, they planted them in these types of mounds or clumps. And what they would do, they would have these mounds, and they could range in size from maybe about 3 feet to maybe about 6 feet in diameter. And they would put half a dozen so corn stalks in each one, and they would grow these mounds. Well, why were they doing that? Well, they observed they had a lot of advantages from looking at nature. They knew that when things are up high, it was warmer and drier, and things grew better when it was warmer or drier, as opposed to lower, when it was damp. And of course, we have raised garden beds today, don't we? Also, it's easier to aerate the soil and easier to share nutrients if you're doing this. If you want to use fertilizer, like putting fish down or whatever else, you could just put it right into the center and all of these can share it. It was much lower tillage because you're only kind of digging up these little amounts, so it's much, much lower for erosion. Actually, 80% of erosion that happens in farmers' fields happens between this narrow window between when they originally till the soil for planting and when the plants start getting big enough to stop the soil from eroding. In that window of a month or so is when 80% of the soil is lost by farmers' fields. Well, by not tilling up this whole area, they save all that erosion. Also, it made it very easy for crop spacing. I mean, there's certain crops like grains that you could just broadcast the seed. Like if you're planting grass seed, you don't got to get picky about planting each one a certain distance apart. You could just throw it because grasses don't care if they get clumped together. Corn does. Corn has to be spaced a certain distance. So it was a very easy system for them to say, well, if you're going to make a mound that's 4 feet in diameter, that means you put in 4 corn plants. If you're doing one 6 feet in diameter, you put in 5 or 6 corn plants. So they had easy systems they could use to get the proper and keep the proper spacing among the plants. And also, it was very good for weed control. One of the ways it was good for weed control is they only had to worry about these areas for weeds, and then the rest of it they could let grow weedy, and they knew that was a good thing because they realized something that's only been learned by people in the West over the last 50, 60 years. And that is that lazy farmers have fewer bugs. It was always this anecdotal observation that farmers who had a lot of weeds tended to have less pest problems. And that's because there's a lot of good bugs that exist in the weeds that eat the bad bugs that eat the crops. And the Iroquois observed this in nature. And they didn't want to fight with the bugs. They wanted to use the bugs as their companions to help them. So they encouraged a lot of the good bugs with the weeds to eat the pest in the corn. Today, that's given a sophisticated term, integrated pest management. The other thing is this system of mounds made soil rotation very easy. All you had to do was rearrange the mounds a little bit. And most settlers at that time, when they were planting fields, they could only plant a field for maybe about 4 years or so. After 4 years, it was spent and they had to move on to another field. The Haudenosaunee could farm the same cornfield for 10 to 12 years before they exhausted the soil by moving the mounds around. And also by planting these weeds between the mounds, not planting, but letting the weeds grow between the mounds, that was replenishing the soil with other types of things to keep it going. The Haudenosaunee observed in nature that when they looked at companions, that plants help each other. They felt that the plants themselves had strong spiritual power. The plants, we had these ideas on how to help each other and grow. Because when they looked in the wild, they saw, well, look, plants like these plants have flowers and these other plants are next door to it. So these bees are going to these flowers, but they're also going down to these other plants that don't have fancy flowers and they're pollinating them as well. So by going next to the brightly flowered plants, these plants are helping each other. I talked about before about repelling pests, how the good bugs eat the bad bugs. And certain plants themselves are repellent For example, most people know if you put marigolds in your garden, it tends to repel a lot of various insects that will attack your vegetable garden. Also provides nutrients. Things die and they basically fertilize the soil, and I'll talk about some other later. They provide shade. Ferns like to grow underneath taller plants to get the shade. To provide support, vines going on underneath bushes or trees, as well as moisture. You know, if a lot of plants clump together, it tends to retain the moisture in the soil from the shade. So they took this lesson in what they learned about how plants had spiritual power in helping each other, and that's what they did with their agriculture. They did what they call companion planting. The sophisticated name that we give that today is polyculture. And they came up with this system of planting their corn, beans, and squash. So what they did was they had the big sister that they called it. It was corn. And the corn was support for the beans to climb up, like a trellis. The corn would be the first thing that they would put into the field. Also, corn is a phenomenal food source, but it is a very hungry plant. It likes a lot of fertilizer. Corn is a type of grass. So when you think of grass fertilizer, and you buy it at the store, it's usually got those three numbers there, right? You know, nitrogen, potassium, and my brain is potash. The first number is potassium because grasses really like a lot of. The first number is nitrogen because grasses like a lot of nitrogen. So that's why they put the clinging sister, the beans, at its base. The beans would crawl up and use the corn as a trellis, but the beans have another trick. They can fix nitrogen in the soil. Beans have the property of taking nitrogen from the air, and then from symbiotic bacteria that's around their root nodules, they could take that nitrogen air and put it into a form that goes into the soil. And they could actually fertilize the soil with nitrogen, and then the corn is able to use that key nitrogen because it's a grass to grow, and it's its key fertilizer. Also, the beans have roots that anchor the corn down more. Corn actually has fairly shallow roots, so it anchors the corn a little bit better into the soil. And it attracts certain beneficial insects that eat certain corn borers and things that go after the corn. The third sister is the wild sister, because if you ever planted squash, you know it runs wild all over the place, right? And squash was important because it kept the weeds down in this mound, okay? Also, it cooled all of the roots that are there and kept in all the moisture for both the beans and the corn. And they grew a variety of squash that had real big spiky stems. If you see squash plants, they have these kind of little thorny, kind of smaller stems, thorns on it because they're bred that way, but they grew a variety that had big kind of spiky stems on it. And that was important because that kept the deer out of the corn, because the deer didn't like stepping into these spiky stems. It also kept out different types of slugs and caterpillars and such that would eat the crops because they couldn't get through the spiky stems as well. So all of these plants helped each other. Now, sometimes you've heard these referred to as the three sisters. The Haudenosaunee had another name they gave those called our sustainers. And they certainly were sustainers from a nutrition standpoint. The corn provided massive amounts of carbohydrates that are needed in the diet, extremely efficient at providing those. The beans were very rich in protein and balanced out any necessary amino acids that the corn did not have. Now, one of the issues about people that eat heavy corn diets, like they saw in the Midwest, is they come down with pellagra. It's a disease from niacin deficiency, because corn, even though it supplies a lot of nutrition, it's deficient in niacin. But that's where the squash came in. The squash has key vitamins. It was loaded in niacin, as well as some minerals, and it's in the fruit as well as the seed. They would eat most of their squash dried. they would lay it out to dry so then they could eat squash all year round, especially during the winter, because they knew they needed that to eat that with the corn to stay healthy and not get this disease, pellagra. Now it's interesting how all of these work together. And I'll play something for you. This is an Oneida legend in particular, and it's a story, and it's called The Legend of the Three Sisters. And see if you could recognize the three crops I spoke about in this story of the legend of the Three Sisters.
Once upon a time, there were three sisters who lived together in a field. These sisters were quite different from one another in their size, shape, and way of dressing. One of the three was so young that she could only crawl at first, and if she wanted to stand up, she had to twine herself around her eldest sister. This sister wore velvet green with delicate tendril ribbons. The second of the three sisters wore a frock of bright yellow and enjoyed running off across the field in the sun shone and the soft wind blew in her face. The third sister was the eldest. She was always standing very straight and tall above the other sisters, trying to guard them. There was only one way in which the three sisters were alike. They loved one another very much and were never separated. They were sure they wouldn't be able to live apart. After a while, a stranger came to the sisters' field. It was a little Iroquois boy. He was as straight as an arrow and as fearless as the eagle that circled his head far above in the sky. He knew the way of talking to the birds and the small brothers of the earth, the mouse, the groundhog, the chipmunk, squirrel, and fox. The three sisters were very interested in this little Iroquois boy. They watched him fit his arrow in his bow, saw him carve a bowl with his knife, and wondered where he went at night. Late that summer, the youngest sister in green velvet, who couldn't stand up without the help of her big sister, disappeared. Her sisters mourned for her until the fall, but she did not return. Once again, the little Iroquois boy came to the three sisters' field. He came to gather reeds at the edge of the nearby stream and make arrow shafts. The two sisters who were left watched him and gazed at him with wonder, as they noticed prints of his moccasins marking his trail to the field. That night, the sister who dressed in brilliant yellow and always wanted to run off across the field disappeared. She left no mark of her going, but it may have been that she set her feet in the moccasin tracks of the little Iroquois boy. Now there was only one sister left. Tall and straight, she stood in the field, not once bowing her head with sorrow, but it seemed to her that she could not bear to live in her field alone. The days grew shorter and the nights grew colder. Her green shawl faded and grew thin and old. Her hair, once long and golden, was now brown and tangled by the wind. Day and night she sighed for her sisters to return to her, but they did not hear her. Her voice, when she tried to call them, was low and sad like the wind. But one day, when it was the season of the final harvest, the little Iroquois boy heard the crying of the third sister. He felt sorry for her, so he took her to the lodge of his father and mother. Oh, what a surprise awaited her! Her two lost sisters were there at the lodge, and little Iroquois boy, safe and very glad to see her. They had been curious about the boy, and they had gone home with him to see how and where he lived. They had liked his warm log house so well they decided to stay there for the cold winter, and they were doing all they could to be useful. The little sister in green, now quite grown up, was helping to keep the dinner pot full. The sister in yellow sat on the shelf drying herself, for she planned to fill the dinner pot later. The third sister joined them, ready to grind some meal for the Iroquois family's bread. Ever since then, the three sisters spent their spring and summers in the field together and their winters in the log house, helping to feed the family of the little Iroquois boy. And the three have never been separated since.
It's a nice story. Sometimes they talk about a fourth sister, sunflowers. The Haudenosaunee would plant sunflowers all around the border of their fields, almost like a giant fence. Why did they put the sunflowers in? Well, the deer would eat the sunflowers and not go into the corn because they like the seeds and such. And also they would attract birds that would come in and eat the seeds of the sunflowers. And they liked those birds coming into their cornfields. As a matter of fact, in their cornfields, they would plant poles, and on the poles, they would put up birdhouses that they would make out of squash. Because they knew these smaller birds, like these nuthatches and chickadees, would eat the corn borers that were in the corn. And you say to yourself, well, why would you want to attract birds? You would get crows in there eating all the corn, right? Well, have you ever seen the little birds and crows? Little birds don't like them. They'll chase the crows away as well. So they, again, rather than with fighting the birds, they cooperated with the birds and they used the birds to help them control the pest and control the crows that were eating their corn. Well, this looks like a nice harmonious system with nature, but you say, well, you know, sounds nice, but how efficient could that be? How could you feed people like that? I mean, how many ears of corn are we talking about getting into little clumps? Well, Cornell University did a study, and they planted 2 cornfields. One the way that the Haudenosaunee did, and another one that the way they do in modern times. And they did a test to look at how efficient and what the yield would be from these cornfields. So they did the corn in the mound with the squash and the beans, and they did the other ones in the rows. And to make things equal, what they did is they just let the fields grow. They didn't irrigate them, they didn't throw fertilizer on them, they didn't weed them, they didn't put pesticides on them. And when they let them grow, what they found out was that they actually got a 30% higher yield in corn from the one planted like the Haudenosaunee than the other one. So even though the Haudenosaunee field had much fewer corn stalks planted than a traditional cornfield, they got so much more corn off of each stalk, they actually had a higher yield. And the Cornell scientists felt that was due to less loss from pest, more nutrients from the way that the beans were supplying the nitrogen into the corn, more water because of the way it was retaining moisture in the mound, and better pollination because the mounds were up higher and actually it was easier for the wind to pollinate the corn. When the settlers moved in first into this region and they saw the Haudenosaunee cornfields, they were amazed at how much better their yields were than what they had from their yields, their fields where they were planting in more traditional ways. Well, they had pretty big fields we talked about, like 1,000-acre fields were the big ones, 100 acres. They had good yields. So how much corn they actually getting out of it to feed their people? Well, if we look, there's an account from, it was called the French and Iroquois War. Now you heard of the French and Indian War. There was also something called, different than that, called the French and Iroquois War, sometimes referred to it as the Beaver Fur Wars, because they were fighting over rights for beaver furs, the fur trade. And in 1687, the French and Huron attacked the Seneca village of Ganondagan, which is kind of right down the road there. And they reported that they destroyed their warehouse of 1.2 million bushels of stored corn. How much is 1.2 million bushels of stored corn? Well, you may have been out in the country and seen one of these corn silos. You can see the size of it here. There's a semi-truck parked outside of it, right? Good size thing. They hold like 1,000 tons of corn silo. 1.2 million bushels of corn would be 34 of those silos. So it shows you the massive amounts of crops that they were able to harvest and keep and store to feed the people in the Confederacy. Nowadays, they feel that agriculture to some degree is in a state of crisis. And it's this issue of sustainability versus yield. We have done so much to pump up the yield of these fields that we're feeling the negative effects of it today. And they don't feel that this is sustainable to keep growing agriculture in this way. I mean, we're piling massive amounts of fertilizer to get the yields up, and as a result, there's no such thing as a clear stream anymore. You look at all the streams and waters, they're all green from algae, from all the farm fertilizers coming in. And of course, everyone's aware of the amount of pesticides that are in the foods now. There's a big movement towards organic products. Massive amount of erosion I spoke about from this tilling that's going on of the soil. Lack of diversity in plants. The Haudenosaunee planted over 20 different varieties of corn. We have a very few number of corn, so like 3 or 4 varieties of corn that are grown. And the danger there is if some kind of disease or something hits that, we don't have a lot of other varieties to fall back on. In water, massive amounts of water and irrigation that's used. And it's a major problem in the Midwest where they're depleting the major aquifer that's used for most farmers in the Midwest to water their crops. So the future direction of agriculture, and this is the downside of boosting these agricultural yields. So the future direction of agriculture is this idea of sustainable agriculture, where they want to institute a bunch of practices to use less fertilizer and less pesticides and less erosion and more diversity in plants and less water. And that's why people at Cornell and other agricultural schools across the nation are actually studying and looking at the different ways that the Haudenosaunee agriculture was done, because it was hitting all of those marks in terms of the key parts to have sustainable agriculture. The Haudenosaunee themselves had a phrase. They said that people should do things for the seventh generation. In other words, do things to make things sustainable such that your great, 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 great grandchildren would still have these resources and would still be able to take advantages of the bountiful of nature. Well, they had quite an efficient system. How did they organize all of this work? Well, again, their spirituality was a guiding force in this. Women were seen as the creative force because it was the sky woman who made all the assignments of the stars to all the living things. So the Haudenosaunee women were given great power. They owned all of the land. Matter of fact, if you know a Haudenosaunee woman, if they got a divorce with the husband and wife, the woman took all the property because she owned that land. They would be responsible for selecting and removing the chiefs. The women would choose the chiefs because the chiefs were not selected to be bossy people. They were selected to be people that could drive consensus, to be good negotiators, good people persons. And the women saw all of these people grow up as little kids. So they knew what it was like. They knew who can get along with people. So they were in the best position to select the chief. And also, if the chief wasn't behaving as they thought he should, they had the power to get together and remove that chief and replace him. They were the ones as well when they wanted to move to a new area. They decided when they were going to move to a different area and what lands to select. And they were also responsible for all of the planting and growing that was seen as a creative venture. And they were the creative people. And they were responsible for a lot of innovations that we spoke about. Now, each family had a family garden allotment. There was a certain territory within the farm that they had. And they would work and they would till that under the supervision of a matron. And the matron would look after like a certain larger field to make sure everything was okay and people were sharing and working. But actually the women rarely worked by themselves. They would organize fun kind of work groups. The Haudenosaunee women would get together and they would work in what was called a working bee. And they would invite all of their friends and neighbors, and they would come into the field on a particular day, and they would work their plot of land. And the host that was doing this would have some food laid out for breakfast and have some food laid out for lunch for all of the women there. And when the women were working together in the fields, they would sing songs together and they would tell jokes and they would gossip and have a good time. And then when they were done with the work, the host would have like a big pot of mush that all of the women could take some corn mush home so they could have an extra little dish to serve their family when they left. And so they would kind of go from working bee to working bee and work cooperatively with the host to get a lot of this stuff done in the fields. Now, when the settlers moved into this area, the pioneer women were here, they would be stuck in some kind of a cabin all by themselves for months on end, working. And so they saw what the Iroquois were doing and they tried to copy some of those practices. So you've probably heard of this thing they would organize where they would have something called a quilting bee. The word bee, the bee was the Haudenosaunee word for the working group. And the reason they called it a quilting bee, they were trying to form something similar to the working group of the Haudenosaunee. Well, what the heck did the men do, right? The women are doing all this stuff, thinking up all these ideas, running the field, owning the land and all that kind of stuff. Well, they did all of the kind of raiding and defense, which could take them away on these kind of far off war parties. They also were responsible for the hunting and fishing. And it wasn't like they could just walk outside their back door and shoot a deer with an arrow. I mean, they may have to go walking miles and miles and miles away, so they could be away for weeks on hunting and fishing expeditions. But they also did stuff with agriculture under the supervision of the Haudenosaunee women, where they were responsible during harvesting and planting times to do various tasks. And one of the tasks that they had to do was this clearing of the fields, which was not a minor task when you think about what it was like to walk into some kind of a virgin woods and try to clear it out. Especially since, before 1700s and the settlers came over with metal implements, before that they were trying to clear the fields with flint and bone axes. So the system that they would use was something called a slash and burn system for clearing land. What they would do is they would cut down all of the kind of lower brush and lay it out so it kind of dried out and scatter it all over this particular field, and then they would light it on fire. And they would have a controlled burn that would kind of wipe out this particular area. And that was very good because this kind of burning actually loosens the soil and also fertilizes it as well. The ash in the soil would help the corn take up more niacin than it normally would. So their corn naturally had more niacin than they had in other areas in South and Central America. In South and Central America, they always had to treat their tortillas and stuff they were eating with lime to get the niacin there. But the Haudenosaunee, in addition to the niacin from the squash, their corn naturally had a lot of niacin from the ash that was there from clearing the fields. Well, what did they do about great big trees that were there? Well, they had a system, and sometimes it would take them a while to take down a big tree. It could take them up to a year, but they would work little by little on the tree, where they would do a process of kind of burning it and then chiseling it out and burning it and chiseling it out. But the women who were supervising this activity would specify that there are certain trees that they did not want them to touch. They were to leave particular trees at these certain spots in the field. And the reason that they asked them to do that was they wanted to build what's called a watcher stage around it. They would have a platform there with a ladder to get up to it and put something here to get additional shade if the sun was over here. And they called it a watcher stage, not that the person would be watching up on the stage, but they'd be watching people up there. And who they'd be watching would be their children. So the women would put their children up there to play while they were working in the field, and they could easily look up there and keep an eye on them. And they encouraged the children to laugh and to play and to sing songs, and they can make as much racket as they wanted, because the women knew that the more racket that they made, the more that they would scare away any of these things that were going to steal and rob the corn, like the deer and the crows that were there. As a matter of fact, even without the children there, the fields were always filled with constant singing. The women, even when they were by themselves, would constantly be singing in the field because they would sing to their children all the time. And they felt that the corn was their children, and they needed to sing to their children the corn to make that happy, to make the children happy, so they grew nice and tall and nice and healthy. Most of the holidays they actually celebrated all had to do with their agriculture. These were all various religious holidays. The midwinter ceremony, I mentioned they recited the Constitution. The maple ceremony is when they harvested the maple from the maple trees, maple syrup. The thunder dance was to encourage the spring rains. The sun and the moon was to celebrate longer days that were happening, days longer for planting, getting the seeds ready for planting, the actual planting, harvesting of strawberries, harvesting of string beans, harvesting of corn, and the overall harvesting, putting to bed the fields for the day. They not only would grow things in the fields, but from observing nature, they would also kind of do this companion thing where they felt they could partner with nature to help them along. So for example, when they were out and they were canoeing and they looked at a body of water and they saw a certain area look like it was very favorable for growing something, what they would do is go in their canoes and they would scatter in this pond wild rice seed. And the wild rice would grow up there naturally. And then towards the end of the year, they would go over there with their canoes and they would harvest the wild rice. And you can see here where the woman is threshing the rice onto the canoe. They'd bend it over, hit the rice things and thresh it into the canoe. The Haudenosaunee use nuts as a key part of their diet to get oils and various proteins. And they harvested all kinds of hazelnuts and acorns and chestnuts, but they also helped along nature as a companion. They observed and they knew that there were particular types of acorn moths and weevils that destroyed the acorns. They used to take the acorns and pound them into a flour. So what they would do is at a certain time of year when they knew that these weevils and larvae were coming out, they would set a ground fire, controlled fire around the base of these oak trees that would then kill off all of the larvae and they wouldn't have that problem. They loved berries as well as a particular part of the diet. And what they would do there is they would plant a tree, not plant a tree, excuse me. They would take a tree and use either girdle a trunk or do a fire around it to kill the tree. They wouldn't have to take down the tree. They would just have to kill it by killing that candium layer that goes around the bark. And without the leaves on the tree, then the berries around it would have plenty of sun and they can get a much better harvest of berries. So they go into a berry patch and then kill all the trees surrounding it so enough light came in. So it was remarkable when you look at the Haudenosaunee, how they could live in harmony with their good mind and their good attitude of cooperating and working with things jointly to accomplish great things in agriculture and harvesting stuff from nature. When I was learning all about this, I was saying to myself, my goodness, how come they didn't teach us more of this stuff when I was in school? We're learning about local New York history. You know, instead, what do I learn in school when I was there? Well, what we get ad nauseum, I remember when I was in my social studies and history classes, is they would talk ad nauseum about the Plains Indians. Oh, the Plains Indians, they go after the buffalo, and that was their chief thing. And they use every part of the buffalo. They use the hides for clothes, and they make their tents, and they take the sinew for their bows, and they take the little bows to make needles and stuff out of the bones, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Well, our Haudenosaunee, instead, weren't crazy about buffalo. What they got excited about was milkweed. They say, hooray, milkweed. They would get all excited when they would see milkweed. Why? Well, milkweed, you're probably familiar with it, right? It grows out in the fields, and you can see it's kind of a taller plant. It's got those little pods with those little furry things in there. It's got this flower. The pods kind of dry up later, and they form these kind of crusty things. Well, for starters, they took that fluffy stuff, you know, that stuff that was inside those pods, and they would use that to make pillows. They had pillows stuffed with this. And the settlers really liked this idea when they saw the Haudenosaunee doing it, and they would actually take mattresses, and they would stuff milkweed to make their mattresses. Matter of fact, today you could buy pillows that are made from this milkweed down. Here's a little advertisement for it. Sericia, this is the Latin name for a milkweed plant. But the reason they sell these pillows is that they're incredibly hypoallergenic. People that have allergies to down and other substances can use these pillows and it doesn't seem to bother them. And also it's washable, dryable, or it makes a really nice pillow. They took those pods that are on the milkweeds and they pounded them out and they treated them, and they could make a type of clothing from it. They made hats and skirts, and they even made diapers, and they made disposable diapers. Because they took the down from the milkweed, they would load it up into the diaper, and they would have a disposable diaper they could just keep cleaning that out from. They also made a type of paper from it that they would draw on. They didn't have a written language, but they would make drawings on the paper. Oh, they ate just about all parts of this milkweed. They ate the silk, actually. They ate the roots. They would eat the young shoots and stems before it got too large. They would cook up the pods and eat that as well. In addition, the flower of a milkweed is actually one of the sweetest flowers in the entire plant kingdom. And they would make a type of a sugar out of this, and also a type of a jam by boiling down the flowers. They got other substances from the roots of the milkweed, where they could get a compound called escaplane, that we call it today, which is a meat tenderizer. And they would take this compound and put it on their deer meat and rabbit meat and whatever, and they could tenderize the game meat so it wasn't so tough. Also, they could take a compound from the roots and use it as a thickener, like cornstarch, to thicken their stews. They used a compound there as an appetite stimulant, because they didn't know when they would be, especially in the wintertime. You'd go out on a hunt and get a deer, or you may not get anything. So when you had fresh food come in, you wanted to eat as much as possible before it spoiled. So sometimes they'd give them appetite stimulants, especially in the wintertime, so they could eat a lot when they had the food. Also, they used it as a very effective laxative, okay, from the roots. And also the stimulant effect from the laxative was also very effective in doing other things, stimulating postpartum milk, breaking fevers, expectorant, asthma bronchitis. They even use that white milky stuff that's inside a milkweed, and they would use it as a type of liquid bandage. They would put it on cuts and it'd seal it up as a liquid bandage. Inside the stalk of a milkweed, and you can see this woman working it, is a kind of a cord substance. And they would use this to make rope, cords, and threads. They would use it, here's a cord thing made from milkweed. They would use it to make string for their fishing lines. They would use it to make nets. Matter of fact, they found a large deer net because they would chase the deer and then herd them from the wild and herd them into an area where they could capture them in a net. And they found one that was like 30 feet long. They made out of milkweed cord. They would string their bows with this cord. And this was the key cord they would use to tie together the timbers for their longhouse. So it's amazing what they did with this. So I say to you, okay, who was smarter? All this stuff we got to learn in school. About these Plains Indians that they beat us over the head with in school, or our local Haudenosaunee and their milkweed. Now, you look at these Plain Indians, right? They got killed and they got trampled trying to hunt and get these buffalo, right? Super dangerous thing. Nobody got killed or trampled harvesting milkweed. They stepped on this hard, rocky ground, all right? They had to eat this tough jerky from the buffalo meat, which made them constipated. So they were real kind of grumpy Indians. So they wound up like fighting with everybody in the cavalry, and they wound up getting all wiped out. You look at our Haudenosaunee Indians. They got a good night's rest because they didn't sleep on the hard ground. They had these nice soft pillows. They had nice tender meat to chew because they had their meat tenderizers from the milkweed. They were regular all the time. So they were happy Indians. And what do they do as a result? They formed this big confederacy. They got along with each other. They didn't fight. And they went on to have sports teams and big casinos. Now I say to you, who were the smarter and better Indians? The Plain people we were forced to learn about, or our own Haudenosaunee? Well, I'm having some fun here, but I don't want to gloss over the fact that the Iroquois gardeners were quite remarkable in terms of what they accomplished. And people in the past that you could read about that refer to them as primitive in terms of their agricultural practices couldn't have been more off the mark with that type of description. Today, we're learning valuable lessons from them regarding sustainable agriculture. And also there's many valuable lessons we could learn from them today in just how to work well together in terms of how they functioned on consensus and the role that women took, and the contribution that women took in their society. Well, I hope you enjoyed my talk today about the gardeners and the three sisters. And if you have any questions at this time, perhaps Stacy could open up the mics and see if you'd like to know anything more.
Yeah, if you do have a question, I just ask that you raise your hand and I'll unmute your mic so you can ask your question.
Okay.
Looking. I don't see any mics or any hands up.
Well, I have one.
Oh, okay.
Marjorie.
Okay, Marjorie.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. It's not a question, but I would just like to make a comment. I don't know if any of you like to read historical fiction, which I do, and I just finished a book, and it was amazing how much of what he just taught us was incorporated in the book. The author is Laura Frantz, F-R-A-N-T-Z. All of her books are about that time period of the Indians in the like 1700s, I guess, and they're extremely interesting. They're very well documented and really good books. So I just thought I'd make a mention of that, and I can appreciate all of her accurate historical information she's woven into it, because after what I just saw, this confirms all that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. I'm just going to chime in, since this is a great segue, to let all of you know, if you're interested, I'm reading aloud the narrative of Mary Jemison as it was relayed to Dr. Seaver. So if you're interested, I'll be doing that after this program ends. And also, we're on chapter 5 right now, but if you want to catch up, the recordings will be on the Macedon Library's website, MacedonPublicLibrary.org. Let me see. Don't be afraid to raise your hand. I'll unmute you. Oh, here's one. Okay, David Strong. You should be.
Strong.
Yep, it's on.
What was the role of Ganondigan, which is a fairly, or was a fairly large settlement right near here?
Ganondigan had a humongous farm surrounding with it, and it probably had the largest grain storage area of all of the Iroquois tribes when they destroyed that 1.2 million. So it was a very, very important settlement. As I mentioned, the Seneca, the Ganondigans were Seneca. The Seneca was the largest and most powerful of all of the tribes. And Ganondigan was probably one of the largest and most powerful of all of their different villages that they had within the Seneca Nation. I should mention something to follow on what Stacy was mentioning about Mary Jemison. The Haudenosaunee, if they lost a family member that died in battle, then they could adopt a different family member to replace that. And very often they would adopt the family member by taking a captive from another tribe or sometimes from a settler. And they would bring them into the, to replace this family member. And they would treat them like a member of the family. So there are all these kind of stories about settlers being captured and taken prisoner by the Iroquois. And very often that's what was happening. And the interesting thing is when they were recaptured by the settlers and went back to the settlers, very often they would run away from the settlers and go back to the tribe. The children, if you could think about it, they weren't disciplined. They weren't struck as children within the Haudenosaunee. So they would go among the settlers and they'd be in a schoolhouse and they'd be getting whipped. And they would be told, don't speak unless you're spoken to. And the Haudenosaunee children were always encouraged to speak up, come up with their ideas. So a lot of them ran back. And you could imagine the women, if they got into the settler society, where now they were low on the totem pole, and they were stuck in a cabin all by themselves where they had all of this socialization, working in the fields and such. So many of them ran back as well. Okay, are there any more questions? If not, Stacy will be putting a recording of the talk up on the website. that you can view it later, or if you know someone else that's interested in the talk, you can encourage them to see it as well. And there'll be a password as well. Stacy,
Yeah.
correct?
Yes, the link will be posted, as well as an access password that you just put into the little box that will come up when you try to access it. So be looking for that. And there are some other Jack Kowiak presentations that we've offered as well in the recording list. So if you're interested, feel free to avail yourselves of those as well.
And
So
then
thank you, everyone.
And then
Oh, I
Saturday,
see another hand. David Scott.
What was the website?
Yeah, that's what I want.
MacedonPublicLibrary.org.
Thank you.
You're
and
welcome.
then Saturday at 1 o'clock, I'll be doing a program for Macedon as well. It's the third part of 3 classes on understanding religious art. And that'll be this Saturday at 1 o'clock.
And if you want to catch up and be up to speed, the first 2 have been recorded and they're available through the library site. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. That was a great presentation. And I hope everyone has, I'm sorry?
Just saying thank you.
Oh, so I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.